right, good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming out to the Yamhill County Heritage Center. We appreciate y'all being here. So Jade Henness received her education at Azusa Pacific University, and she co-founded the Asian Heritage Association of Yamhill County, which she is currently the board president. This is her second time here at the Historical Society. Today she will be talking about airing our dirty laundry, an early Chinese enterprise in Yamhill County. She's going to discuss the significance of these early Chinese enterprises and their rise and fall as a microcosm of national issues of race, politics, and immigration. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Jade herself.
Thank you so much. That introduction sounds very well written by a previous version of me who was feeling wordy. I promise you the actual presentation will be much more casual. So let's see here. I need to make sure I'm set. I've got my water. I wanted to start by asking actually who was here for my previous presentation that I did here last year. Okay, a few of you, great. Good to see some of you. Yes, I know. Okay, good. And so yes, and if people have questions, you guys will fill in the holes for me, okay? So yeah. Can the lights be dimmed so the presentation is okay? Thank you. Oh, wonderful. That helps me feel more comfortable too, so I feel less in the spotlight. In that previous presentation, it was more about the general history of Asian Americans in Yamhill County. And this time we're going to get a little bit more specific, more into the nitty-gritty pocket lint, if you will, and talk about the details of Chinese laundries. And so these early businesses in the late 19th, early 20th century kept a lot of our Yamhill County residents cleanly dressed and freshly pressed. And it's kind of interesting for me to have spent some time learning a little bit about what that looked like and what that meant for our area. In the late 1800s, every town in Yamhill County had a Chinese-owned laundry business, and some of them had 2 or 3. So today we'll explore the significance of that. But before I dive into that, I want to share a little bit about my history since I was last here. Last time I told you guys kind of about my family's history, the history of my great-great-grandfather who immigrated. I have both San Francisco Chinatown and then British Columbia, Vancouver Chinatown represented in my family's history. And since I was here last time, I was actually able to go to Los Angeles and find my great-grandfather Quan's grave at the Chinese cemetery. So I wanted to share this picture because there was a little bit of an update in my own family history research. And my great-grandfather Quan was born in San Francisco, briefly served in the Army in World War I, and then spent the rest of his days as a cook in Los Angeles Chinatown. And he lived during the times that we're talking about today. And so I think as a descendant of Chinese immigrants, as someone who really loves stories about people's lives and what they lived through, I've always found it a great honor to learn about the experiences and lives of Chinese immigrants here to the US. And it's great to be able to share that with you. So by coming here and saying, you know, I'm interested in hearing some of these stories, I feel deeply honored. And I think it's great to see so many people who think that this is worth spending time on a Saturday to come do, right? So this is part of the reason why when I first came to McMinnville about 9 years ago, and I was hearing that there was a history of Chinese immigrants in this area, I was thinking about my own great-grandparents. And I was like, well, I want to know these stories. I want to know who these people were. I want to know what they did. I want to know how they impacted our community. So that is why we're here. And that's where this presentation came from. And a little bit of the perspective that I have when I share these histories. Also, I first gave a presentation about Chinese laundries a few years ago for the city of McMinnville. They were doing a speaker series. And then I decided 2 days before this to update my whole presentation. So I'm gonna have to lean heavily on my notes. I will try not to sound like I'm just reading notes from a slide, but at some point I will have to, otherwise my brain will go off and we will get lost in some tangential piece of research I thought was interesting in the moment. And that may or may not help us get to where we want to go today. So that is my disclaimer at the beginning about my presentation. So with that, as we dive into the historical wash bin of laundrymen, I like to start with saying that all stories have a broader context. And to, did I actually push this off?
Here comes your ice.
Or did the battery die? I might have pushed the button while holding it. So, but if it happens again, it might be the battery. Okay. I'll let you hold on to that. I always like to start with saying, as we talk about history, we always have to remember the broader context of what's going on. We can talk about one person's life, what they did, what they said, but we need to also understand the world they were living in, the political context, the social context. And last time I was here, we did a little bit of that. I talked more in depth about Chinese immigration history and the Exclusion Act, and I spoke more about the different types of anti-Chinese policies, both nationally and locally. I even briefly touched on how white immigration from the South after slavery here to Oregon impacted the reality of Chinese immigrants here, and helped shape this original idea of Oregon being a whites-only state for a while, right? So those kinds of contexts are things that we're not going to get in today. But I want to mention them, and I want to, remind us that these are some of the bigger picture things that are going on as we're talking about how all of these things, or we need to think about these things and how they impacted Chinese laundry businesses. So I'm not going to repeat all of that history. I will sort of assume a mutual understanding and knowledge about those things. If you guys are coming on a Saturday to a history presentation, you probably know quite a bit about that already. And so in the late 1800s, early 1900s, all we kind of need to remember for today is that there were hundreds, in fact, laws and policies in the United States, some even in Oregon, that were intentionally designed to prohibit Chinese people from immigrating here or wanting to stay here, right? And this climate of the world, of politics, of society, that is what's impacting the stories that we hear about today. And now let's talk about Chinese laundries. So why laundries? One of the things in my family history is Chinese restaurants, right? My grandparents owned, operated, worked in restaurants. And it's a very familiar concept to me. But when I started learning about all of these Chinese laundries and why even a small little town like Amity or Lafayette would have a whole Chinese laundry business, I was like, well, that's really interesting. I want to kind of get into understanding why that was a business idea that they turned to. Because by the 1870s, Chinese laundry businesses had popped up all over the United States. And the more I researched about it, the more it kind of makes sense, right? My first thought was, well, these people weren't commercial laundry operators in China, right? They didn't leave China as laundrymen, come here and be like, well, this is the business I know how to run. Laundry was still women's work in China, just like it was in a lot of, Western European cultures. Cleaning clothes also was really time consuming. Today we have these beautiful laundry machines. They make pretty songs. You push buttons, clothes get clean. But it was not the case then, right? So at the time, few of the predominantly men who had ventured west here for land and opportunity really had the space, the time to do more than just wash some clothes in a creek and hang it up on a line, right? But that wasn't a proper job of your laundry. So researching a little bit, you needed to soak clothes overnight. You needed to scrub them on a washboard with soap. Hopefully you have that. Good quality, bad quality soap. Your delicates should be boiled. That's a fun image. And then, you know, you have to rinse those items multiple times to get the soap out. You would have to wring out all the excess water by hand, or if you were lucky to have some item to help you wring out the clothes, but most people didn't have that equipment on hand. And then you had to hang dry them somewhere where they wouldn't be disturbed. And if you really wanted to appear up to snuff, then, you know, some ironing and pressing would need to be done as well. There were collars, neckties, certain clothing items that had to look crisp in order to look nice. And so this was a time-consuming. Oh, I love microphones. I don't have to yell. Laundry and cleaning your linens was a time-consuming and physically demanding job. And basics, just like I said, washing your clothes in a creek, hanging them up to dry, that was as good as most people could manage. But at the time, in the late 19th century, right, we're thinking about our area here. We have European Americans who had come here, who had claimed land, and they had gotten established. They were transitioning from just being an adventurer to having a town settlement, to having a society, to having, you know, all of the sort of society life things that you would expect. They were bringing their wives, they were starting families, there were social clubs. And society had a growing need for properly laundered clothes. There was the awareness also of communicable diseases and the importance of cleanliness in your clothes and your physical hygiene. And there was the timeless desire to rise up in the social classes, which meant being respectably dressed, spotless and pressed. And so laundry was something that was a constant chore. And the demand was really high for a commercial laundry service. If you didn't have a domestic servant, if you weren't married and had a wife who would just do that for you because that was what was expected of her, being able to pay for someone to get that done for you, there was high demand, and there were few who were willing to do it. Again, women's work. And so there were few competitors for a commercial laundry service in those early days. So now you have the Chinese immigrants. This wasn't their original plan. Most of them had other plans for their employment here, and those weren't panning out very well. So some of them had come here, we talked about this in the last presentation, for mining or railroad work, right? But as I shared before, anti-Chinese laws prevented them from success in mining, and by the 1870s, a lot of the railroads were laid, and it was just maintenance crews that were needed. So tens of thousands of Chinese men who had originally been recruited here from China to build those railroads were now out of a job. But that didn't mean that they could afford to go back home. And so they needed to still make money and make a living in some way. And many of them saw the Chinese laundry business as a good way to pivot. Starting a laundry was an opportunity that made sense. It didn't necessarily require costly facilities or equipment. They could do it by hand. They could get a washboard. They could get basic things to get started. And as they made money, they could grow their business, right? They also got to be their own boss. So it was a smart business opportunity that allowed Chinese immigrants to continue to fulfill their original intention. And many of them originally intended to come here, make some money, send it back home to their families who were experiencing famine and war and poverty, and then earn enough that they could eventually go back and join them. So in this book, this is a book by John Jung called Chinese Laundries, Tickets to Survival on Gold Mountain. He says this: by the 1880s, the hand laundry emerged as a major occupation of Chinese immigrants. The hand laundry served as their first long-term avenue to economic survival. Operating their own business wasn't easy, but they were no longer dependent on the decisions of employers, many who were prejudiced against Chinese. So Chinese laundries became like the first opportunity for Chinese people to really get their feet under them and get settled in a community. And so it was that these wash houses or laundries sprang up all over the country, especially on the West Coast, United States and Canada. This was the business opportunity that was the launch pad for their success here. Chinese laundry workers were putting in really, really long hours. They could turn laundry orders around in a pretty decent time. And for a long time, this sort of work ethic and approach enabled them to compete with the mechanized and steam laundries that started developing in the early 20th century. Many Chinese laundries also developed an expertise with particularly difficult items, collars and neckties that had folds and things that had to be pressed and ironed just so in order to get it right. And you'd have to pay a little bit more to have those done. But the Chinese laundry workers, many of them were really, really good at getting that just how you liked it and for a pretty decent price. So if they could make a profit, they'd often use that money to send it back to China to support their family, or they'd save it up and try to bring their families here, as most immigrants tend to do, right? I finally got a business going. I've got a stability now. Now I'm going to bring my family over. So in the early days of what we now call Yamhill County, it's no surprise that we had a bunch of Chinese laundries. Amity, Lafayette, Sheridan, North Yamhill, Carlton, Dayton, Newburgh, and McMinnville all had at least one. McMinnville had 2 or 3 at one point. And so evidence of these laundries is found in newspaper archive advertisements like this one. In 1893, Quang Lee had a laundry on Dayton and 2nd Street in Newburgh. And I'll go ahead and read it. It's an interesting look into an ad. So it starts off with the title, "Washi, Washi, Washi." And then it says, "Hold on there, Mr. Man. Stop washing your shirt in the river. Go to Quang Lee if you want your shirt done up nice. He says he will wash your dirty shirts and make them look all the samey like snow on Mount Hood. White shirt, washed and ironed, 10 cents. Collars and cuffs, 25 cents per dozen. Family washing cheap." So I'm sure someone at the newspaper was like, okay, you want an ad? I'll write up a nice one for you. Yeah. There's a lot that we could unpack there, but I think it's really interesting to have it mentioned, don't be going to the river or the creek to wash your laundry. We've got someone who can do this job for you. This is sort of the way that people were changing their perspective to washing their clothes. Oh, I can pay someone to do that, and it's actually worth it. It saves time, and I get a better result. And suddenly commercial laundry is a thing that people do, right? So Amity, these are Sanborn fire insurance maps. I sort of cropped them to the point where we can try to see what's written here. It says Chinese laundry, like really small. And so this is Trade Street and 6th. Trade Street is 99, right? So this was likely operated by a 23-year-old man named Yuan Sen, according to the census record. He's listed as a laundryman in Amity at about the same time that this insurance map was created. So here is our Amity location, and here's 2 of our McMinnville locations. This is let's see. Blue here, Chinese wash house, and then over there, Chinese wash house. A Street, Adams, right? And County Road, that's 2nd Street now, basically, roughly, right?
That's actually the driveway into the library.
This is the driveway into the library. Okay, so things got shifted a little bit. But you imagine today, we've got like library, we've got the police station, all these things. So this is kind of a significant location in 1884 because it's at the very edge of town. There's no 2nd Street that goes to the West Hills neighborhood back then, right? This is just sort of the edge of town, and there was a water source, right? And I think it's fascinating. There's 2 not that far from each other. So there's enough business in 1884 for commercial laundry that there's 2 Chinese laundries operating just a few blocks from one another at the end of town. And being at the end of town was also kept them a little bit removed from the bustle of town and those who maybe weren't happy that they were here. So if you wanted and didn't mind patronizing, being a customer of the Chinese wash houses, you could go to them, but not everybody loved that they were here. So that was 1884, and then in 1912, those 2 locations are gone. A public auditorium had been built on one of those sites, I believe, and now in 1912, just a block over to Baker Street B here, there is still one Chinese laundry that is on the map at that time. And then after that, I'm not sure how long it lasted, but I believe this laundry was operated by a man named Samyuk, who was known as McMinnville's popular Chinese laundryman. I talked a lot more about him in my previous presentation, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail this time. If you guys have heard me speak at any other event, I usually go into a lot of depth about Sam because he's a very interesting character. He was written about in the newspapers a lot, and it reveals a lot about what his life was like here. Unfortunately, since my last time here, I haven't had time really to follow up with you and get into those archives because Sam is written about so much as the popular laundryman of McMinnville. I do believe that there is more to his story that is in some of our local archives that I just haven't been able to get eyes on yet. Maybe you've found a few things since then, a few. And so I think at some point it would be really interesting to make sure we've gathered as much info that still exists about him to really paint a picture of the details of his life. And I add to my presentation every single time I find another mention of him somewhere and get more details. So Chinese laundries were pretty successful nationally, locally. There were a lot of places where they were getting great business. Unfortunately, because they were so successful, they were also targeted. So here's another quote from the Chinese Laundries book. It says, as Chinese continued to expand their presence in the laundry trade in the late 19th century, whites became increasingly alarmed that, quote, hordes of Mongols would take over the country. So again, the success of this laundry business was helping Chinese immigrants have a chance at making it in America and being able to afford better situation in life, to maybe bring their families from China here. And as soon as a man sets down roots with a family, they become a long-term part of a community, right? And in some areas, operating a laundry was really the only way a Chinese person would be able to make it. Nobody else was going to hire them. There was a lot of advertisements I showed in my last presentation where they say no Chinese employed for local hotels where they might have a cook, or restaurants. A lot of businesses used it as an advertising tactic to let people know, don't worry, we don't have Chinese workers here, right? And so if they couldn't be independent and operate this laundry business, there probably wasn't another way for them to make a living in some of these areas. And for those who were anti-Chinese and who did not want them to stay around, they realized this. If we take away this source of income, if we take away the success of the Chinese laundry business, then we take away the ability of these Chinese people to be able to stay. And so targeting Chinese laundries was something that played out both on the national and the local stage. So here's an example of a more national level. As much as I can, I like to use clips about national news even when they're from local papers, because I think it's really interesting to see this is what our local community would have been reading about in the local paper. This is 1897, and They're talking about the United States Circuit Court has decided that tapioca flour must be taxed a duty of 2 cents per pound. And then it says, tapioca flour is used almost exclusively in Chinese laundries. They were going to tax a good that really only one group of people were using for their business. And this tax would almost exclusively raise the cost of operating costs, the operating costs for Chinese laundries, but not necessarily other laundries. And so, yes, they're using it as a cheap starch for the clothes. And apparently enough Chinese laundries were using tapioca flour as a starching agent that this article says this tapioca flour is the most formidable obstacle to the starch manufacturing industry in the United States. So if all the non-Chinese laundry folks were using something else, that wasn't good enough to keep US starch manufacturing going, I guess. But I saw this and I thought, it's interesting that they even note that this only really is going to impact Chinese laundries. It's not going to really impact anybody else. In addition to taxes and tariffs that placed outsized burdens on Chinese laundries, there were also, primarily in like California, San Francisco area, zoning laws and curfews that targeted Chinese laundries. So like I said before, the Chinese laundry workers would kind of work around the clock. They put in a lot of extra hours. They take shifts so that they could get their orders turned around pretty fast. In the Bay Area, there is a few mentions of city curfews that were implemented that would prevent laundry workers from being able to work around the clock. And then it would sort of hinder their ability to do a quick turnaround on the business. And also, there was an interesting zoning law in the Bay Area that happened, and we'll talk about that now. So because of these targeted efforts against Chinese laundries, Chinese laundry business would end up playing a role in shaping civil rights in the United States. So in response to anti-Chinese laws and violence, let's take a step back and look bigger picture here. In response to these things, a lot of Chinese Americans at the time formed associations for mutual support and legal representation. At this point, we had quite a few Chinese Americans who were born or had learned English pretty fluently, were born here, were educated, they were studying law, right? They were representing themselves in court where they could. And so they organized and they fought discrimination and they won some important battles. For example, in 1878, the Supreme Court case, United States versus Wong Kim Ark, and that established birthright citizenship, right? So that was the organization efforts of early Chinese immigrants and Americans shaping our country's laws. And so here we have another one in 1886. It was a laundryman in San Francisco area named Yik Wo, and his case went to the Supreme Court. So this is a picture. You can see, you can kind of see. At the top, there's linens hanging to dry above, like on the roof of the business. It's pretty common. You don't need to advertise when everyone can see from down the road that this is where the laundry's drying. So here's what happened. The city of San Francisco had declared that laundries couldn't operate in wooden buildings without a permit. Now that's pretty fair. Fires tend to damage entire settlements, cities, right? So you can't do a laundry without a permit, and failure to operate without a permit would result in fines or jail time. There was nothing in that law that on the face of it was discriminatory. It was just, you have to have a permit, you can't operate otherwise. As it was, most Chinese laundries operated in wooden buildings, yet when they applied for these permits, they were all denied. In contrast, white-owned laundries that operated in wood buildings quickly got their permits approved, or some of them actually could afford to operate out of a brick building, so they didn't need the permit. So Yik Wo got fined because he continued operating after his permit was denied. And he refused to pay his fine, and so he was jailed. And this is the, habeas corpus. So he's jailed. The legal folks like rally around his particular case as one that they're going to take up. So they're like, wait, we need to look into this. And the attorneys that were working with the Chinese American associations contested his detention and the ordinance itself. This case ends up going, long story short, right, to the Supreme Court. They claimed the ordinance, although it didn't appear to be discriminatory in how it was written, it was still enforced in a discriminatory manner, and therefore was against the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So in the end, Yik-Wo won. And the case is important because after the 14th Amendment and equal protection under the law, they wanted to have a case that could say that applied to economic activity. This amendment applies to businesses. And Yik-Wo was the opportunity for them to get that and set a precedent. This also applies to how businesses operate, equal protection under the law. So since this judgment, Yik-Wo precedent has been cited in over 150 Supreme Court cases. So a Chinese laundryman who's like, no, I'm not going to pay this fine, ends up being the reason that equal protection under the law can be applied to economic activity and therefore impacting over 150 Supreme Court cases after. So, of course, targeting laundries. Of course, there were some more insidious ways that Chinese laundries were targeted. This example, if you study or ever look into Chinese American history, you'll always come across these caricatures and cartoons from the WASP because they were particularly hateful toward Chinese people. And they have some of sort of the worst depictions of Chinese people on purpose because they're trying to incite this disgust toward Chinese immigrants. So we have this denigrating political cartoon. It's an unflattering caricature of a laundryman. He's got Monopoly written on his hand, which is over these laundry items, a wash bin, some clothes. And there's further info on each of these items. It's very symbolic of how they felt. And it says the coming man, like inciting fear that this is who we are allowing to be successful in our country if we support Chinese laundries, right? We don't want this. There were also cases, aside from just, terrible sort of caricatures and depictions, there were also cases of laundry buildings that were damaged or destroyed intentionally in order to deter the Chinese laundrymen from operating, and the workers themselves being attacked and harassed on occasion. And then on the local level, here is a brief mention of the Dayton Chinese Laundry. Usually I have the note up here. Oh, something did not transfer in my slide. I usually have the note about which newspaper and what date it was, but that didn't get copied over. My apologies. But this is in Dayton. It was operated by a man named Young Gay. So it was on First and Ferry. Circled it there nicely. Unfortunately, it was the Yamhill County Reporter. Okay, in this it says that Young's laundry was closed and his equipment was seized because apparently J.T. Reed and Company had sold him wood and then he had failed to pay for it. And it ends with saying, Gay will add another to the Chinese population of Portland. And so a lot of newspaper archives have talk about wanting the Chinese to just go back to the city or wanting them to just, we don't want to hurt you, but can you just go away? Kind of an attitude. And given what we know about how Chinese laundries and their businesses were treated, I have questions about this story. Obviously not paying for something that was sold to you is not good. I wonder, did he need an extension? Was that offered to him? Was it common to seize the assets of a business and completely close a business when they failed to pay for some wood? Was that how Marshall Dorsey handled all of those cases, or was it just a convenient way to quickly shut down the laundry and try to get the guy out the door? I don't know, but those are the questions that kind of go through my head when I come across these stories. Newberg Graphic, 1893. I also found this bit of insight into local perspectives. And I'll just read it. It is stated that there are some boys and a few who are older, so you're not all kids, who persist in disturbing the inmates of the Chinese wash house by throwing stones whenever opportunity offers. This is not right and should be stopped by proper authorities. While we do not favor encouraging the Chinese to start a laundry while there are so many white people who would be glad to do the work, we protest that it is wrong to abuse them so long as they attend to their own business. There are places where a Chinaman can make money by washing, and if he cannot do so here, he will go away one of these days. This, we think, is the proper way to solve this question. I love this, not because I think it feels good to read it, but because I think it's an interesting insight into the local perspective. This person seems like a pretty nice person on the front. They don't want you throwing stones at people. That's not right. However, we quickly see that they're still very anti-Chinese. They don't want them here. They just want to ignore them until they go away. They'll be very polite, they'll be very kind, but they will ignore you until you hopefully just go away. And it's interesting to note that, not everybody who was against Chinese folks were necessarily mean to them. They just didn't want them to succeed so that they would hopefully leave. And I think that's really interesting perspective to look at and to see written so plainly. Another Yamhill County Reporter clip, 1894. Strictly no Chinese employed at the McMinnville Steam Laundry. Hence, clothes returned to you clean and pure. Interesting. So I looked up the McMinnville Steam Laundry. So here's a plug for your local research library. Okay, a lot of this information is in there. And putting the pieces together is really fascinating. So I found that it was William Lambert who built and operated the McMinnville Steam Laundry around 1888. And so he advertised on the strength of not employing Chinese people. And because of this, the clothes were pure. But I looked up the McMinnville Steam Laundry in the library here, and in that folder, there is some commentary from someone who was writing up what they remembered about that business and about the time. And it said this, it said, the advent of the steam laundry. Okay, so we were doing hand laundry, but now we have steam machines that make things better and faster. The advent of the steam laundry and the disappearance of the China wash houses removed a fruitful source of diversion from the mischievous-minded boys of the 80s and 90s who were wont to gather on dark evenings and throw rocks at the China house. It's so fascinating. It's also fascinating of just, how people wrote at the time. It was very, very poetic, who were wont to gather on dark evenings. But it's an interesting bit of just little vignette of local goings on at the time. So it seems that throwing rocks at Chinese laundry workers was happening in multiple places, McMinnville as well. It was a pastime of some young folks. So again, McMinnville Steam Laundry, here's another one of their ads a little bit later on this side. It says, we wash before we iron, we give your shirts, collars, and cuffs that rich gloss finish that characterizes perfect laundry work. Our plain work is washed by a process that makes the clothes healthy to wear and are far superior to Chinese methods of laundering. Send in a trial order and be convinced. Price is reasonable. So it's superior to Chinese methods. What are they talking about? I wanted to look that up. And what I found was that the methods of Chinese laundry that they were alluding to is what is sort of inaccurately depicted in this ad for Pioneer Laundry in 1911. This is actually in Canada, a British Columbia laundry. And their ad shows another caricature of a Chinese laundry worker, and he's just spitting or maybe vomiting, it looks gross, onto the clothes. And the caption reads, "Do away with this, patronize a white laundry, white labor only at Pioneer Laundry." And so there had apparently been this idea that Chinese laundry workers were directly just spitting onto the clothes. And it was an intentional misrepresentation of something else that they were doing as a method of starching and ironing the clothes. So there is a Chinese laundry exhibit, a little section of the Portland Chinatown Museum. You guys should definitely go there sometime. And I believe they have an example of this there. So they didn't have, at the time, these wonderful plastic bottles we use today that you go shh, shh, and it sprays this nice fine mist on things. Your plants, your clothes, your Windex, whatever. I love those bottles. But back then, Chinese workers devised a way to mist the clothes with a bowl that had a bunch of little perforated holes at the bottom. And then they'd have a glass straw that they'd use to put pressure into the bowl, and then the starching liquid would come out in a pretty even mist. It was effective, it was quick, and that was turned into, they're spitting on your clothes. And so that is why it's unclean, and that is why it is impure, and that is why our methods are superior, is the message that is being put out there. It was an exaggeration in order to incite, again, disgust about how Chinese people did things. And this played on those pre-existing anti-Chinese ideas that we talked about before, that Chinese men were disease carriers, right? That they were, all of them were opium addicts, all of them were out to get your women, all of them were gamblers. It was a very interesting list of faults assigned to a specific group of people. And so with this local McMinnville ad and the Pioneer Laundry ad from Canada, you can see that this idea was widespread, right? It crossed national boundaries. Another way that Chinese laundries were treated differently was in the classification of a laundry owner versus another business owner. So when the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882, it hit owners of Chinese laundries, businesses different than those who owned other things like mercantiles, grocery stores, boarding houses, things like that. So if you were a Chinese person and you owned a grocery store, a mercantile, a medicine shop, you were a merchant. And if you were merchant class, under the Chinese Exclusion Act, you could still come and go. You could go back to China and then you could come back to the US. But if you were a laundry owner, even if you didn't do the work yourself, although most of them did, of course, just like a grocery store owner stocked his own shelves, right? If you were a laundry owner, you were just laborer. And this mattered because laborers weren't allowed to come and go under the Exclusion Act. They weren't allowed entry at all. So here, if you were merchant class and you went home to visit or do some business and you wanted to come back to the United States, you had to prove that you were the right type of business owner. And this is an example of what that proof had to look like to be successful. So this is Chin Tong Quan, his paperwork. He was a merchant in Corvallis. This document contains the written and sworn testimony of white men from Corvallis, lawyers in this case, who were vouching for him as merchant class. We've known him for 3 years. He's always been engaged in business as a merchant. And by their testimony and signatures, this man was, I believe, able to gain re-entry back into the US after he went home for a visit. In contrast, Chinese men who so much as owned a laundry in conjunction with another business could be denied re-entry when traveling back to the US solely on the assumption that you probably engaged in laundry work. If you own a boarding house and a laundry, you're probably not really merchant class. You're probably laborer. We're going to deny you entry. And there were a few cases of that, which is an interesting thing to think of, that being associated with laundry would relegate you so quickly to this second class status. So consequently, many of the Chinese folks who went home for a visit weren't able to return to their businesses and to the work that they had been laboring so hard to get established here. So in spite of the hardships, Yamhill County did have two Chinese laundry owners who became very popular in our local community, and they're talked about a lot in the newspapers. You can look them up in the research library as well and find out some more information in their files here. I actually discussed them a lot more in my previous presentation, but I want to touch a little bit back on their stories for those of you who missed that presentation. Quan Hop had a laundry in Yamhill Carlton. Sam Yik, as I said before, was here in McMinnville. And so there is a newspaper article that has this sort of line drawing to depict Quan Hop. I sort of colorized it because I was thinking that looked more interesting than a grainy black and white line photo. I hope you agree. That's my Photoshop skills right there. So Quan Hop immigrated to the US in 1873. There's some super fun stories about him. For a while, he operated a laundry in Yamhill, but he also did a few other things. He was branching out to different types of businesses, maybe because the laundry was only so successful, so he tried some other things too. But in the Sanborn Fire Insurance Map in 1893, there is a laundry here on the corner of 2nd and Olive. I don't know for sure if that's where he was, but perhaps it is. And then in 1921, on a different map, this laundry has moved over to 3rd Street. Little note in my presentation, but Quan did have family in China. And according to one sort of set of newspaper stories that happened over a couple weeks of publication, it says that he applied for naturalization. It didn't work out. It seems as though the local county clerk initially approved it because, oh yeah, we know you, you're great, sure. I think it's fascinating that at the time your local county clerk could process immigration paperwork or a naturalization case. But then of course, you know, people were like, no, you can't do that. He's Chinese. This is the exclusion era. You can't do that. And so they said that the paperwork had to sort of be returned and be officially denied. And it didn't work out for Quan to achieve naturalization here. But it does also say that he held Chinese New Year's dinners for the local community. I think one of the newspaper quotes says that 70 ladies and gentlemen of our town came to Quan's Chinese New Year party, and he had food, and it was very well attended. They had a great time. He also joined a local church. He was involved in the community. He was pretty well known. And you can see, you know, in the depiction of him, it's very Western. He doesn't have the stereotypical braid queue and hat. His hair is cut short. He's wearing your sort of typical hat of the day, I suppose. Although I will say his collar does look a bit more like the buttons I have on mine. But I think that it's really cool to learn more about him and Sam Yik as well. So Sam Yik was a laundry owner in McMinnville between 1888. Okay. Between 1888 and 1901, I find a lot of mentions of him in the newspaper archives. He's described as popular. He's mentioned for telling jokes. They retell some of his jokes in the paper. He handed out lilies for Chinese New Year. And at one point, he had a Chinese artist come to his shop, decorate, and he invited folks to come and see Chinese calligraphy and artwork that was displayed at his shop. So he was sharing his culture with people. He was creating community. He was attending local events. People were, his face was very familiar. There was one point he gets sick, and even that is mentioned that, you know, some attorney and some lawyers, sort of like some important people, and Sam Yik are sick with the flu. And I thought that was an interesting thing that he's mentioned by name. He's not a Chinaman. He's mentioned by name and in the company of known people of the town. I think that the archives reveal that, Sam was known here, had many friends here, and people genuinely were interested in his comings and goings, and that's why his comings and goings were written about in the paper. And so from that, we find that he did intend to bring his wife and his children from China. Apparently he had twins. And it seems as if he succeeded in bringing them as far as Portland, but they weren't able to stay. The next mention after him bringing his family to Portland is that he has returned his family to China. And then it's mentioned that he is now back after leaving his family in China, and he's operating his laundry again. Someone was operating it for him while he was gone, but now our favorite guy is back. So if you want to see Sam, he's here, he's home. But he did have the desire to, he was doing well enough here. He could have brought his family and he could have had his kids grow up here. It said in the newspaper clipping that he wanted his kids to go to school here. I don't believe that there was a court case in San Francisco about Chinese children being able to attend public schools. I'm not sure if that had been decided yet, so I'm not sure he would have been successful in that anyway. But that was his intent. And at the beginning, when I showed that map of 1912, of that one remaining Chinese laundry at the time, I think that was him, because in the 1910 census, Sam Yik is still listed as living in Ward 1 of McMinnville. But then after that, I can't find further mentions of him yet. To be determined. We might still find something more. But that is all I know about his journey here so far. If anyone else really likes going through old newspaper archives, let me know. And I'll share some of the research that I have with you. Maybe you'll find some fun tidbits about his life. So some of the paintings that I've had as part of my slides are by a Chinese American artist named Mian Situ. And he's really known for depicting his imagination of what life was like for Chinese immigrants in the late 19th, early 20th century. We don't have a lot of photographs. We don't have a lot of depictions of their experiences from their perspectives. A lot of times when Chinese immigrants would write home, they wouldn't share these flowery stories about the details of their life and experience. And they'd be like, hey, here's some remittance money, kind of a thing. And that was enough to let their family know, okay, he's still alive. And if they got a letter back, it was mainly their family being like, oh, so-and-so is really sick and things are really bad, send more money. But there wasn't a lot of flowery conversations depicting the details of their life. And so what I really like about this artist is he thinks about our shared heritage and ancestors who came here, and he thinks, from their perspective, given what we know historically, what might it have looked like, for example, for a Chinese businessman who had been fairly successful and had brought his family over and wanted to celebrate that success by getting their portraits taken, what might that moment have looked like? And that's not the type of representation we usually get, right? What we usually get is those caricatures from the WASP. And obviously, that isn't the truth. And here we see something a lot more humanizing and see something that can kind of create an imagination or visualize an imagination of what it might have been like for Sam had he brought his family here. And I think it's kind of neat to look at these images and go through that process of imagining what it would have been like. So let's see, we're winding down here. While it appears that most of the Chinese laundries here in Yamhill County hadn't been able to overcome the obstacles that had been placed in their path, it does seem that Quan Hop and Sam Yik really stand out. For a couple of decades, at least, they had become fixtures in our local community. They had friends here, they earned a living. And And I think that's really remarkable. I mean, I think about my own great-grandfather, I think about what he lived through, I think about finding his grave. Like he didn't return to China. Well, he was actually born here, but his dad died here as well. So my great-great-grandfather, his grave is also in LA Chinatown somewhere, and I haven't found it yet. But that will be my next trip, I hope. So I think it's really remarkable what they lived through, the resilience that they had to make their life here. In the 1880s, the census showed that there was over 100 Chinese people living in Yamhill County. A lot of them were railroad workers, some of them domestic servants, some of them cooks, laundry workers. But there was a community of them, and they would get together and they would celebrate Chinese New Year. That's listed in the local paper of like, oh, it's that time again. All of the Chinese around Yamhill County are coming to McMinnville. So be ready for the fireworks and be ready for the fact that they aren't going to do work for 2 weeks. So don't ask them for nothing. And they're buying up all the chickens and the pork and they're getting ready for their party. And then by the 1930s, they're all gone. And in the end, not even Quan and Sam were able to really make it here. They were denied citizenship. They couldn't bring their families. The obstacles facing them with their laundry businesses hindered their long-term success. They did try a few other business ideas, but in the end, they did what so many seemed to hope that they would do. They returned to China. At least we know that with Quan. I'm not 100% sure with Sam. I suspect, but until we find further information, I'm not sure. And as sad as that is, or maybe because of it, like I said, I find their stories really remarkable. And I think it's really cool to know that they lived here, had this impact on our community for several decades. And it's kind of an interesting what if, we had generations of Yiks and Quan's families that had grown up here and were still a part of our community today. Something I think what would it have looked like for a little corner of town in McMinnville to kind of be the Chinatown, the hangout spot, right? And speaking of that and our community today, what that would look like, I will end with talking about the Asian Heritage Association, the museum, the basement, and all of that. So today, the Asian Heritage Association, myself, we also have, is Jean still here? Oh, you moved. Okay, behind John Deere is Jean, one of our founding AHA board members, Eliza. Hey, one of our current board members, and a handful of other folks are a part of the board of the Asian Heritage Association. And that kind of started because when, as most of you probably know, down on 3rd Street in the basement, there's this historical sort of museum in honor of Chinese history and immigration locally, that the Warwickses got started, and the current building owner, Marilyn Kossel, and her husband are keeping that space as is and available. And so when I shared this space with my friends, I first got a tour from Marilyn Warwick's before she sold the building. And then I asked if I could bring some of our community down there and kind of show people what was here. Some of my local friends here, who were also Asian American, were like, wow, it hits different. When you see a place here in this community, and you know that like 100 and some odd years ago, like we were here, like what? So it kind of blew our minds a little bit, and we were like, what can we do to make this, to preserve this, to build on it, to make it available, to, like more people should see this. This is really cool. And eventually we realized, gosh darn it, we're gonna have to form a nonprofit. So we did start the nonprofit so that we would be able to pursue accepting donations that were tax deductible, hint, hint. Also here, donations tax deductible, hint, hint. But also because we know that there are funding for historical preservation, especially for minority communities and cultures, and we were hoping to be able to tap into that and be able to put that into that basement museum space for the preservation of our local history, the celebration of it, and being able to share it with our community in a bigger way. But that is a long-term project. We would love folks to reach out to us if it's something that you're interested in participating in. In the meantime, though, we party. So coming up is Chinese New Year. And the other thing our organization does is put on a Lunar New Year celebration for the community. And, you know, Chinese New Year is sort of the Chinese cultural celebration of the lunar solar calendar New Year, but we call it Lunar New Year because Koreans also celebrate this, right? A lot of other Asian cultures celebrate a lunar New Year traditionally, and we have this year a bunch of other, there are flyers at the front desk, grab one. We have a bunch of cultural performances that will be at the community center February 2nd, 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. I expect to see all of you there. And so we have Korean cultural dance. We have the lion dancers, of course. We have koto-kai, Japanese instruments, the stringed instruments they're going to be performing. We have 2 different wushu kung fu demonstrations, a tai chi demonstration. So please come and join us. This is something that means a lot to me. I have 2 little kids. I have a kindergartner and a 3rd grader. And I know when I grew up, like, there wasn't this type of cultural celebration in my community. And now having this here, this is our 3rd year doing it. And every year so far, there's these folks who come up to me and they're like, you know, it's so nice to meet you. I'm half Chinese. These are my kids. It means so much to me that they get to come and do this. We don't have to go all the way to Portland for an event, you know, although do go because those events are great. But it's nice to have that here and have them feel like these celebrations and acknowledgments of these cultural holidays is something that's part of our local community as well. And so it's a lot of fun. We also have some vendors. So there's some foods and snacks and different interesting things you can purchase if you'd like to come shop. And there's free kids activities. So if you have children, grandchildren, anyone in your life who likes to face paint or make some little crafts, there'll be plenty of those things to do as well. So I'd like to invite you to come to this, but since we have time, I'd also like to go back to just the general history. And if it's first of all, any info that you guys have or stories you would like to share, I'd love to hand you the mic. Every time I give a presentation, I always meet someone in the community who knows something or has heard something. I was at the Hillside Retirement Community giving a presentation, and someone's like, oh yeah, you know, my son bought this building in Amity, and they found that it actually had this secret like back exit down through the basement. And the history was you know, the Chinese laborers used to live in this historical part of the building, and that was a way for them to kind of like, you know, oh, they're coming knocking on the door. Like go down and like leave before they come and ask who's here, where are your papers, doing, you know, doing a head count, right? And it's fascinating to hear those kinds of things. So if you guys have anything to share, I'd love to hear. Also, if you have any questions, I can do my best. I'm not as good as Google, but I can do my best to answer any questions you might have. Thank you. Yeah.
What years were the Chinese not allowed to live within the city of McMinnville?
So the question is, what years were the Chinese not allowed to live within the city of McMinnville? So, or have an establishment. So this is, you want the short answer or you want the more accurate one? More accurate one. Okay, so when it comes to not being a certain group of people not being allowed to be within city limits, that's typically called like a sundown town, a sundown law, right? And it could apply to any group of people. In some areas, especially here in the West, it applied to Chinese people, Japanese people, South Asian. But in other parts of the country, it would apply to Black people, right? And sometimes the laws were explicit and written, and sometimes they were just sort of socially enforced. If you come into town, someone will very aggressively let you know, you better not be here when the sun goes down. Or they just couldn't buy property, people wouldn't do business with them, that kind of thing. And so locally, in another presentation I do that's like the myths and legends of Asian American Yamhill County history, I kind of talk about this local story that we have, that there was a Chinese restaurant that wasn't allowed to operate within the McMinnville city limits, so they were just outside. It's now the Mazatlan building, that's right. So back when they started in the 40s, 50s, that was just outside of the town limits. And if you look online, there's even someone who posted on a website that they believed that when the city annexed that property, that the owners were like, you didn't want me, I'm leaving. I don't want to be a part of your city and pay taxes to you guys since you didn't want me. So that was a story I really quickly was like, I need to find out more about that. And here's what I found out. So one of the owners of that building, Wing Louie, a name you guys are probably familiar with, who actually passed just a year and a half ago now. He passed recently. I found out that his son, Richard Louie, is still doing business here, is in Portland. So I hand wrote him a letter because who actually opens your mail? Okay, yeah, right? So when you get a letter in the mail that's clearly handwritten and not like fake handwriting that the printer prints out to make it look, and then they're like, your car's extended warranty. I like, this is clearly written by a human, And so that's why he opened it. He actually called me up. He read my letter. He called me up. He's like, I was about to just throw this in the trash. But I was like, wait, someone actually wrote this. And in the letter, I said, hey, I've been looking for you. Because your father owned and operated the Oriental Gardens here in McMinnville. And there's all these stories about how you weren't allowed to be here and all that stuff. And actually, Richard is now on the board of the Asian Heritage Association. He's our treasurer, so you'll get to see him if you come to our event, and probably his grandkiddos too. But what he told me is this, and I actually did a video oral interview with him and one of his sisters, and what he said is that, the details of that weren't really a talking point in his family. His dad was focused on doing the best business he could. And as far as he understood, originally that location, it was a different building. It had burnt down, they had to rebuild, but originally that location was kind of a little bit of a bar that had enough equipment for them to operate a little bit of a business. They grew it over time. He doesn't have this memory of we are ostracized here on the outside of town. They lived in the Portland area and drove out here every day to operate their business. He has this memory that his father, I should say, and is it Roger Moore, his business partner, that they saw this as a decent opportunity and a fine location, and what they focused on was just trying to grow their business and do the best they could with it. Obviously, he was aware of the racism growing up, but I think there was also a lot of, don't dwell on it, just focus on what you're trying to do and kind of ignore it. And so he's like, my dad never had any ill will or didn't harbor any thoughts about this town excluded me and therefore, I'm going to leave. When he retired and sold out his portion of the business, he was just tired and done and ready to be retired. And they had diversified their business. They had purchased land where the Winco was actually piece of land that they had purchased and owned. They had to put in that traffic light there at the corner in order for the city to approve Winco to be like built there. So their family actually invested in developing parts of McMinnville. And so I think that it's one of those cases of two things can be true. That there's definitely a possibility that Roger and Wing Louie looked at other properties and were not, given the time of day, right? And that this was maybe the only place that they could afford and that was willing to do business with them and let them lease and then eventually buy. I think it can also be true that his family's experience and memory of it sort of considers that to be inconsequential because they were here to make their life, and other people's thoughts about them are their problem, right? Which is actually a pretty healthy way to go about life sometimes. It's like, what you think about me, that's kind of your problem. The difficulty, though, comes in when there are very distinct other cases locally where we know that Chinese workers were sort of run out of town, or they were approached by an armed group of men in a hop field just on the outside of Yamhill County and told to leave, or under threat of violence or murder. We know that those things also happened too around the 1920s, and I think that if you're going to look at just the history of sundown laws and the time at which those exclusions, either legal or just social, would have existed, a lot of that began in more earnest as you had migration from the South, both formerly enslaved people leaving, right? And that became a way to deal with people whose color you didn't like coming into your area, a sundown town. So really right after the end of slavery, and all the way into, so with Chinese immigration on the West Coast, you have a new influx of Chinese immigrants coming in around the 40s and the 50s. There were the folks who came prior to Exclusion Act. There were those early groups of people. But then you had the Exclusion Act, and that really hindered immigration for a while. But then in the 40s and 50s, as we suddenly needed an ally in China for the war, and I think I had this in my last presentation, there's actually this poster that says, it has a picture of a Chinese soldier. It's like, this man is your friend. And suddenly the US sort of invested in a marketing campaign to make people realize, no, the Chinese guys are actually really great. They work really hard. They're really good neighbors. They're great allies. It's the Japanese people we have to worry, right? And so it's interesting that, so you have Chinese exclusion ending, and the US is like, never mind, you can come. We like you now. And then you have this influx of people like the Louis family and the Moore family in the 40s and 50s coming from the Hong Kong area, well, mainly. And they start doing restaurants. So restaurants took over, they used to be laundries. That was the first long-term way to be successful, was to open a laundry business. And then in the 40s and 50s, the new wave of Chinese immigrants, it was restaurants. The American people had developed a taste for Americanized Chinese food. And so that's where even my dad grew up folding the to-go boxes in my grandpa's business up in Vancouver. So the restaurant business, again, is more familiar to me from family history, but the laundry business was what originally started. And so some of the laws about exclusion, in some places where it was more explicit, could have still been on the books, even though it wasn't enforced as late as the 1990s, 2000s in some areas. But the social practice of it, I think, probably started dying down after Chinese exclusion and the changed narrative about Chinese people being our allies and friends. And then again, with immigration and the third wave of Chinese immigration as the People's Republic of China opened up their laws to allow their folks to leave more freely. And in the early 2000s, the US is like, yeah, please send us your engineers, send us your highly qualified, educated folks. Now you had a new wave of Chinese immigrants who were making six figures, highly educated, buying homes in really nice neighborhoods. And at that point, no one was really preventing them from coming because look at what they were bringing to our community. And it's kind of interesting to see how the social practice of exclusion started shifting once the narrative was, they're not coming to steal our jobs, they're our allies, and now, they're the people who are boosting our economy, actually. And then, of course, things have shifted in the past 20 some odd years again, but such is history, right? So not like a solid answer, but I would say that after that original group of 100 or so left in the early 20th century, so by 1930, a lot of them were gone. I think at that point, people locally were kind of like, okay, well, they're not here, we don't have to worry about it. So I would say the height of that social pressure to not come and be here would have been in the local area, 1920s to 1950s. But I don't think that was necessarily like an explicit written law or an explicit sign posted on the edge of town. In some places that did happen. I don't think that happened here. But I do know that there is a clear gap in our census of when there was a lot of Chinese folks and Asian folks here, and then they're all gone. That's part of why, yeah, so the basement museum, it's part of what is known in a sundown town is you can't be like seen outside on the streets, right? And so finding a place that has a nice basement set up where you can kind of enter in through the back, not have to be on the main street, and you can have your setup down there. It's kind of ideal. And that's part of the history, I guess, about that basement museum that we want to preserve and find a way to share with more people. This would have been probably the only place in town where people were like, yeah, you can be down there, just don't come out, right? So, yeah, any other? Yes.
I sense that so much of this prejudice has to do with people are going to come and take our jobs. My question is, was this prejudice more common in rural counties in Oregon and less common in cosmopolitan areas throughout the state? I've served on a number of Yamhill County committees, and I find that what people seem to be afraid of in Yamhill County these days are Portlanders.
The townies.
The Portlanders out of Yamhill
Yeah.
County.
Yeah.
Which seems to me to be rather bizarre. But is that prejudice to be found more in rural areas and yes, and less in Portland, Salem, and throughout?
Yes and no, because there's different types of prejudice and different layers, right? When you're talking about prejudice that has to do with class or with the association of where you live and maybe your political affiliations, right? That can change when you layer onto that prejudices and biases that have to do with race or culture or national identity. And so I think I can't like fully, I don't have a PhD in this, but what I see with the Chinese history is that their sort of this perspective of the time of a Chinese person's identity being primarily a foreigner, not white, and maybe just an enemy in all of the ways, right, was more important than where they lived, in the town or in a rural area. Because certainly there's a reason why all of these major cities across the world had Chinatowns. It was the only place in those big cities that Chinese people were allowed to be and wouldn't be harassed. And that's why the Chinatowns formed. That's why you still have one in, Vancouver and Sydney, Australia, right? And those are big, big cities. And even though they had maybe more resources there, a bigger community there, they could have their associations, they could be established in a strong enough way to still have a lot of those Chinatowns technically existing today. A lot of them have gone away. That shows that that identity and that need to only be in one certain place, that prejudice was very strong there in that town. I would say that out here in rural areas, you would still have it, but because there wasn't a large enough neighborhood of Chinese people, sometimes you find that they were kind of tolerated because they weren't a big enough group to be a threat to anybody, right? And so it's possible that, Sam Yik and Quan Hop experienced a little bit more friendliness and leniency here simply because they were the one exception, right? And they didn't represent a group of 100 folks trying to buy up a corner of town. There's just one guy, he's pretty nice. The Chinese candies are good, the laundry's good work. And in some ways, he was like an exception, right? And but obviously in a lot of other ways, a lot of other Chinese laundrymen did not experience that same getting to be an exception, getting to be the sort of the folks that people allowed to see as fully human for a moment, I guess. But so when it comes to race and national identity and cultural difference, I'm not sure it matters much if you're rural or if you're city. What does matter is if you're city, you might have a larger community of resources and therefore protection. And there would be a benefit there. But then maybe the heat would be on your community in a bigger way. If you're rural, you're kind of on your own. And if you can endear yourself to your community like Sam did, then maybe you can kind of float under the radar or be well-liked enough to not be bothered enough. But if you don't have that kind of luck or social skill set, you might be like young Day, who misses a bill and gets his business taken, right? And so, and you don't have that protection of a broader community. And so there's a slightly different experience there. Then if you layer on those other things, like if the difference is just political identity or class identity, I think those experiences can impact one another, but sometimes they can play out in a different way, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Does the Asian Heritage Association include Korean, Japanese, Vietnamese, etc.?
Yes, so myself and Jean, we have Chinese heritage. Our vice chair, I just spilled something. We haven't yet voted on her being a vice chair. She's currently the secretary, but she's gonna be the vice chair after our next board meeting. She's Korean American, Jill Mann. And Eliza, also we've had Peter Vu, he's Vietnamese. He actually moved back to Alaska. We had Vietnamese on the board, Filipino, Korean, and Chinese. And we also have some white people on our board because they're very committed to helping us make sure that we do a great job and they have skill set we need. And we're not excluding folks if you don't have Asian heritage from being on our board. But it is an important part of what has made our group strong is that we have representation from a wider group of Asian cultures. And we can be thinking about the kinds of things our communities think about when we think about things like Lunar New Year. And it's celebrated by more than just Chinese people. Sometimes people will say Chinese New Year, and they'll use that to represent anyone who looks Asian and celebrates the holiday. And we're like, oh no, that's why we call it Lunar New Year, because we're intentional about bringing in other Asian cultures to what we're doing and recognizing that Chinese people aren't the only people who celebrate this. And the Chinese zodiac isn't the only version of a lunar solar zodiac calendar. Other Asian cultures have different animals on their zodiacs. And if you come to our event, you'll get to learn a little bit about that with our zodiac scavenger hunt. It's a lot of fun. So again, you should come. Anybody else? Okay. Okay, so the question is, in the year of our Lord 2025, do I still feel like people are prejudiced against me because I'm Chinese? Yes and no. I'm half, I'm mixed. So I enjoy a little bit of ambiguity. Especially when I have blonde highlights in my hair, you know. When I'm really tan, people think I'm Hawaiian or something. Unlike some of my friends who are full-blooded Chinese, and it's very obvious their Asian traits are very strong. They get treated very differently than I do in some places. So as someone who's mixed, like sometimes I can kind of float under the radar. But that being said, I always get, so what are you? And it, you know, it depends on the day whether or not I'm like, or if I'm like this, and then I make them feel awkward. But I don't experience it often because of that, but I do see it happen, and I do occasionally experience it. I've had someone, you know, tell me to go back to where I'm from. And, you know, I grew up with the eye pulling and things like that. So these, so the Chinese, yeah, almond-shaped eyes, right? And so, yeah, people sort of tug at the edge of their eyes to sort of make fun of the physical appearance of East Asian eye shapes. That's something that I got growing up. And then there's even like weirder things where like a coworker one time got in the car with me to make a delivery, and they're like, wow, you're a really good driver. Thanks. I think. So it's an interesting experience, you know, to live in today's world where you have a lot of engagements with people and they're totally just cool. And then every once in a while someone will say something where you're like, you might want to think about where that came from in your brain. You know, like, where did that idea come from? Why would you think I wouldn't be a good driver? You might want to think about that. But I'll let you handle that. But so it does still happen, and it really is important. That's another reason why our Asian heritage community occasionally, like, we put on a lunar event for the community because we want to invite everyone into that fun celebration. But a lot of times we also do events where we're just over at Jean's house making dumplings, and we get to kind of sit around amongst folks who have similar life experiences, similar cultural backgrounds. You know, Jean's speaking Cantonese with one person 1 minute, then she's speaking Mandarin with somebody else the next minute. And it's great to be able to sit around with folks who share that common language, whether the language is the language, or the language is the food, or the language is the cultural custom. And to have that in our community here really is life-giving. And it makes it a lot easier to then go out and know that on any given day, someone might be like, go back to China. And you're like, I was born in Tillamook. What do you want from me? You know, so yeah, I was born in Tillamook, and they had more colors of cheese than they had people, you know, in the 80s. So that's maybe a different experience than some of my friends who grew up maybe more in Portland or areas where they actually had a stronger Chinese community, and maybe people had learned a little bit better how to interact with Asian folks. But I definitely grew up in an area where the only Chinese people in town were the folks who ran the restaurant. And then there was like me, who was half. And there was a Japanese, we had a neighbor, she was Japanese, and so her daughter was half too. And it was very good for me to have her as a neighbor growing up. I'll say that. You also had a hand raised? Yeah.
How is the ex-restaurant accessible to the public?
Oh, the museum in the basement? Okay, great question. Thank you so much for that. So right now, it's not accessible to the public. This is a building that was built in the early 1900s, and it's the basement of the building. It is not up to code for public invitation. However, Marilyn Castle is the private building owner, can invite her friends to come see her space. And so right now, that's kind of where we're at is with not being able to advertise publicly that we're having a tour, please come and sign up. But being able to kind of word of mouth say, hey, we're going to do a tour. We can have about eight to 10 people. And it's something that we've done on occasion, and it's done kind of sometimes just by request. And that's what we want to do as AHA, the Asian Heritage Association. Our first step is, because we actually have a temporary agreement with Marilyn Castle to be able to get some bids on the space and what would need to be done to the space to get it to the first step. The first step is making sure there's a good point of egress and there's, fire, extinguishers and all the basic things you would need for us to be able to operate for the city's purposes, 6 tours a year with a limited amount of people, right? We don't want a lot of traffic going in and out of there because it's just not officially safe. But if you do 6 tours a year with 8 to 12 people, once you've gotten these few things taken care of, then we can start there. We have been talking to contractors and electricians and trying to get bids and quotes to see what it would look like to truly make it publicly available. It is very not ADA accessible. What would it look like to make it ADA accessible? What would it look like to ensure that the space wouldn't flood on occasion? What would it look like to truly make it something that we could say, hey, on these days, an AHA member or docent is available and the door is open, come on by, right? That exploration phase is currently what we're in. And we're very aware that in that exploration phase, we may find this is a project that would require a lot more money than we'd be able to raise. And so what alternatives might there be? But if anyone is interested, probably this spring or summer, organizing a small group of a private tour by request is something we do a lot. I've given those tours. Jade, I think you've been down there with people. Jill's gone down there with folks. Even Marilyn Castle, who owns the building. If folks reach out to her, she'll be like, sure, I'll show you around and kind of give you the story and the tour. I do have a video of Marilyn Warwick's giving a tour to a group of folks. And once we have help getting that video edited, it will be up on our website. So if you want to take the virtual tour with Marilyn Warwick's it was her husband and Carl Smith who really got that going. You can hear the stories that she shares about the building, which are pretty great. I guess her and her late husband, when they bought the building, there was a moment where they like, oh, what's in here? And then they're like on dirt, like below the basement floor. And it took them a minute to figure out how to get back out. She's like, for a second there, I thought this is where we die. No, but there's a lot of great stories and history that she shared. And I'm glad that I was able to record that. And we'll be able to have that up on the website, as well as the oral history of Richard Louis and his sister, talking about what it was like growing up with their dad operating this restaurant, Richard going to Linfield and being a part of the local community for so long. So we will have those resources up at some point. If anyone knows someone who likes to edit video, send them my way. All right, well, thank you guys so much for coming. And yeah, hope to see you on the 2nd. I will hand the mic off to you.
Just a couple of closing announcements. That wasn't enough applause for Jade. Can we do that again? Thank you.